All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity, and we're going to start off 2026 with a doozy. So today to talk with us about what's going on and what has been going on and what might go on moving forward in Venezuela is our former ambassador to Venezuela, Jimmy Story. Jimmy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelly. Pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate it. Just to let people know, Jimmy was also a senior fellow with us at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and has now kindly joined our board of advisors. So whether we want to or not, we're going to see a lot more of Jimmy in the coming years. So
Let's
glad
hope
to
you
have
want
you.
to.
Yeah, yes, glad to have you. So, I'm sure everybody that listens to this podcast has been following this story quite closely. But let's still start off by stepping back for a second. So you left Venezuela, the country, not your job as ambassador, in 2019 when the U.S. Was expelled from the country, the diplomats. Um, what was the political mood like there? And, how have you seen that develop until now? Was it like vastly different than what we have now? Or was it still kind of the same as it is now?
So, they have cycles in Venezuela. They talk about this all the time. Cycles of engagement, cycles of not participating, cycles of going towards elections, cycles of coming together, cycles of breaking apart. I'm talking about the democratic opposition here.
Yeah.
But just as a point of clarification, we were told to depart January 23rd when we recognized Guaido.
Mhm.
Eventually, 60 countries did. But I spoke to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and said, if we don't recognize Maduro as the president, then I'm going to ask interim President Guaido what he wants us to do. And he asked me to stay. So we stayed on for another 2 months, myself with a group of Marines, diplomatic security, a couple political officers. There were 28 of us, actually. And we hung on for another 2 months because we felt that our duty was to strive for democracy, support democratic actors, really work in that space, work with civil society, and continue to fight what was becoming an increasingly repressive dictatorship. The mood of the country it started with Juan Guaido's assumption of duties as interim president. Very euphoric moment. They believed that was finally going to be the thing that changed things. Yeah. And when we lowered the flag on March 14th, 2019, one political leader told me, "You've abandoned us. This is no longer. We feel adrift. We no longer have any support." So over the course of the next few years, you had different political parties on the Democratic side attempting to go in their own direction, and they finally coalesced and under the unitary platform, and they had a primary. And María Corina Machado, who just won a Nobel Peace Prize, she won that primary with over 90% of the vote. When she was barred from running for president, Edmundo Gonzalez was chosen in her stead, and he won the election in July of 2024. So moments of extreme optimism, moments where that nadir it was very pessimistic. And now we see another moment where it's very optimistic, but people are starting to question, well, what's really going on here? What happened? Was this regime change? Or is this just change in management of the same regime?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely want to get to that in a minute. But walk us through viewing it from the outside, but still heavily involved and following this more closely than most. What did you see as the evolution of the Trump administration policy towards Venezuela over the course of his second administration so far, leading up to, say until January 2nd?
Well, it's interesting. The first administration, I got to go back a little bit. There was a focus. There was a focus on democracy and human rights and liberty and access to freedom. That was the focus. That was the reason we were working so hard. And then after the events of January 3rd, it was quite clear when the president mentioned petroleum, oil, or natural resources 20 times. It didn't mention democracy once. That the focus had shifted tremendously. In the first Trump administration, all options were on the table. He talked a lot about the options, but didn't really bring any assets to the region. We put tremendous pressure through sanctions and other avenues on the regime, but it fell short of dislodging them. In second Trump administration, it felt like this was unfinished business from his first go round, and he started out as a counter-narcotics operation, which clearly it was much more than that from the very beginning. And then it ended with the removal of Maduro. We can talk about whether or not what the strategic piece of this is going to look like, but tactically, it was an extraordinary success. It's a historic success, the tactical success of that evening. Now the question becomes, what are the objectives of the administration, and how do you get there working with the same dictatorship?
Right. And that leads me to my sort of next question. And you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times just like December 30th, and talked about the need for democracy and the removal or stepping down of Maduro. But in your op-ed, you framed it as if Maduro goes, the whole regime goes. Now we're in this and democracy, and then we can work with the democratic figures and bring in the opposition. But now we're in this strange world where Maduro has gone, but we are trying to work with the remnants of his regime to maintain stability and power. So Maduro is gone, but we have none of that democracy and none of that opposition in there. So, what are your thoughts about that and the viability of something like that?
Well, a lot of different ways to look at this. The closest example to Venezuela, I believed, was Panama. But in Panama, there was a democratically elected president that couldn't assume the presidency, and then he was installed after the invasion and Operation Just Cause. We have the same situation here, but Edmundo Gonzalez's name has never left the president's lips. And in fact, in his press conference, which was pretty extraordinary, he basically said María Corina couldn't do much within the country. It appears as if the Central Intelligence Agency, it kind of spun the tale that Delcy Rodriguez was a softer version of Maduro, perhaps, or of this Chavista movement. And the New York Times ran a piece on her wearing a kind of a sweater and making her look like an easier person with which to deal. And to the extent that bringing in Edmundo Gonzalez and María Corina Machado and just installing them would have led to the requirement for U.S. troops on the ground, I believe, because they don't have the connections to the military. They didn't do kind of the preparatory work of saying, this is what life is going to look like during a transition. Something that I was kind of pounding the table on in that op-ed in the New York Times and other things I was doing. What is it going to look like? What does the future look like for the people around Maduro? And they didn't do that kind of work.
Right.
So I understand the idea behind co-opting part of the regime, but there needs to be a time schedule on this. So there wasn't really a plan. There became a plan a couple of days later. Marco Rubio said it's going to be stability, recovery, and transition. Well, what's the flash to bang on this?
Right.
How long is stability? How long is recovery? And when do we get to transition? Because I will submit.
And what do they look like? Like, what are you define those, but what does that, look like on the ground?
I mean, is stability the military in Venezuela operating together with the military of Colombia to go after the ELN of the border areas? Potentially. Is it getting rid of the Cuban agents, Iranian agents, and other provocateurs in the country? Potentially, that's it. Is it getting rid of the colectivos? This is part of the repressive part of the regime. I think that if the president's objective is to fix the economy via oil production, you have to start the transition now. This does not get easier over time. And some of the things they should be doing the hard asks right now, while the regime is still trying to consolidate power. And some of those hard asks are release all of the political prisoners at once, not 15 here, 20 there, 30 there. There are 900 political prisoners. They should all go home. allow anybody to run for elections, get the colectivos off the streets. These are that motorcycle gang that basically responsible to responds to Diaz de Cabello. Do the hard ass now, because it's not gonna be easier in the future. They're consolidating power behind Delcy, and they're consolidating the repression against the populace. Most Venezuelans wanted to see Maduro gone, but they're not on the street celebrating because they're scared of the regime.
Right. So that leads is a good segue to my next question, just to follow up on that. Maduro is gone. The regime still is there. So it sounds like, from what you're saying, that we actually haven't seen any change on the ground, or it's still repressive. They haven't released any political prisoners. Like, basically, Maduro has gone, but nothing else has changed.
Well, they've released some political prisoners.
Okay.
The pace of that release is a little slow for me, but the CIA director was just there yesterday. Right. I'm assuming that there was some messaging there on speeding up the pace and making sure that Diaz de Cabello disbands the colectivos, they work against the ELN, they stop drug trafficking. That's my assumption, right? I wasn't in the room, obviously, but those are the asks I'd have right now. I'd also want to take receipt of 5,000 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles they have in the country, which is something that, between that and anti-ship missiles and some other offensive capabilities from the Russians, put it all in a warehouse, lock it, and give us the key. That's a possibility, and we should be making that ask now. But to the extent that the same regime is there, and they're couching their adjustments. For instance, there's a new hydrocarbon law that's going through. They're saying, well, this is what Maduro wanted. When they released political prisoners, they said this is in response to what Maduro had asked us to do. And make no mistake, when Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president, she did it in front of Nicolas Maduro's son. And the first three people to greet her afterwards were the Cuban, Russian, and Iranian ambassadors. I mean, this is signaling.
Yeah.
And my assumption here is having worked with this regime, having negotiated with this regime, looking at the history of their negotiations, is they will attempt to give us, the United States, just enough,
right,
set the hook, give us just enough over time to keep things going as they currently are, in the hopes that the president loses the midterm election and his ability to react or act inside of Venezuela is greatly reduced.
Well, not only that, we've seen, that this president has gone from, Ukraine to Gaza, back to Ukraine, to Venezuela, now to Greenland. So this administration's ability to really focus on something for a long period of time is very limited. And I'm sure the Venezuelans are looking at that and thinking, maybe if we just say what we need to for long enough, he'll move on to the next shiny thing and kind of forget about us. But I think that's where, and you could mention this as well. You noted this shift in some unfinished business, but also the shift in the two Trump administrations. What role does Marco Rubio play in that? And his, Cuban background and his desire to, the role that Venezuela plays in propping up Cuba. And I think that could also be something that means that this might be one issue and topic that they do remain engaged with, because Rubio is looking at this so closely.
What's interesting is, as ambassador, I briefed Secretary Rubio, then Senator Rubio, more than any other member of the Congress. We never once, and I was just quoted in the Atlantic on this, never once talked about oil. We always talked about what Secretary Rubio's North Star is, which is liberty. And in the case of Venezuela, it was a focus on liberty. It was a focus on democracy. It was a focus on restoring constitutionality and the rights of the people. To the extent to which Secretary Rubio would like to become President Rubio, I would imagine we're going to have to get to the transition phase in Venezuela at some point within 18 to 24 months, because he's going to be ginning up a run for president. And what he doesn't want to have is that this was just purely gunboat diplomacy and Yankee imperialism, right, but rather the liberation of a people. And let's not forget that he certainly looks at Havana through the lens of Caracas. And there are a lot of people in Washington that do that.
Yeah.
But Secretary Rubio is definitely running things now. To some extent, he wasn't expecting to be running things, if I read his body language correctly at the press conference. There's some talk of Stephen Miller being involved to some extent, and that's hard really to verify. But the group of people that work on this issue is relatively small.
Yeah. And you mentioned oil, and that was, you talked about the press conference as well, and the fact that the opposition wasn't discussed at all, but this focus on oil, and not as much on democracy and liberty and freedom, and those things you just noted. Walk us through the fact, the Venezuelan oil production has drastically diminished over the course of the past decade, 2 decades. What realistically would it look like to try to enhance that infrastructure, refit that infrastructure, and get oil flowing from Venezuela again? Because we saw in the meeting where President Trump got all the oil executives together, none of them were falling over each other to jump back into Venezuela.
It would take $100 billion in a decade to get back, and you have to. First is the complete lack of human capital. They've completely gutted PDVSA as an organization, and PDVSA has to run, according to hydrocarbon law in the country, either directly or through joint ventures, all the exploration of oil in the country. So good people to listen to on this are Ricardo Hausman from Harvard and Francisco Monaldi from Rice University. But I think we should step back, and since this is a Georgetown podcast, let's think about history a little bit. And you're a historian, Kelly. So you can appreciate that the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the reunification of Germany, which some people say is still going through reunification, right? There are a couple of things are necessary conditions for money to flow into a country after a democratic transition. Can you move around without having extra security? Can you move your money in and out of the country through normal means? And finally, can you have a contract with an independent judiciary, and they're willing to stand up to their own government to protect your rights? None of those conditions exist in Venezuela. So when Exxon CEO said it was an uninvestable project, he was exactly right.
Right.
Now, having said that, you're going to see economic activity, and it's going to get people lathered about it. But what you're going to find is it's government expenditure, it's first movers that with local money, and it's people operating on the margins. So let's say I'm a private equity firm with $2, $3, $4 billion. I want to do a JV with somebody, or I have a project where potentially I could come in and provide a service, like a service provider. You'll see that kind of activity. What you won't find is a ConocoPhillips that's owed $11 billion coming in with $20 billion to do massive rework of oil fields and all of the investment that'll go in. It just won't happen. And it won't happen because you've got boards of directors for these big companies. They're on the stock exchange, so you have shareholders, and they're not going to put themselves in a position of putting good money after bad until you have certain conditions. So the idea that we're going to first fix the oil industry before we get to transition just isn't going to happen. It didn't happen in Poland. It didn't happen in Libya. It won't happen in Syria. Look at all the capital is a coward. It's not going to go where it can be lost. So I have a hard time. I think things will be said. Some smaller players are going to get involved, but is it at the scale that can fix an 80% decrease in GDP? Not in the short run.
Yeah. Yeah. And not, with the same regime in power as well, because all those questions you just mentioned still are in play. All right, I'll get you out of here on this last question. Looking down the road a little bit, President Trump, we're recording this Friday afternoon, January 16th. President Trump just met with Machado yesterday at the White House. She, it was all over the news, presented him with her Nobel Peace Prize. And
She had a gift bag
yeah,
when she left too.
it's like presenting at the Oscars or something. But we've seen this president in the past, sort of be, cozy up or change his mind when people act a certain way when they're around him, when they meet him. And we've seen some leaders that have learned that lesson and been different the second time around when they come to talk to him, or have taken that lesson on when they come to talk to him the first time. Do you see that shifting things in any way, shape, or form, that meeting that took place yesterday? Or, just more broadly, what are some things we should be watching for in the next month, say?
Yeah, I don't think the meeting with Maria Corina Machado moved the needle much. But let's see. I hate being a naysayer because
Mhm.
there's been some positive movements. Wrongfully detained Americans have been released. Some other really important political figures have been released in this release of political prisoners. Rocio San Miguel is one. Ronald Carreño is another. I mean, these are important people who, journalists or organizers who were just picked up because they were holding the regime to account. The reason why I believe we need to act with some alacrity here and ask the tough things of the regime now is because they're still off-footed,
Right.
while they're trying to get themselves together. So to the extent to which we can get them to operate and do some things that open up some more democratic space, maybe it's going to be allowing people to opine on public media. Something as small as allowing DirecTV to have access to CNN in Espanol. It's a small thing, very difficult for the regime to allow happen because they don't want to have a counter narrative
Right.
in their communication space. These are the types of things that I'd be asking for with regularity right now. The other is, and I'm now an international affairs analyst for MS Now, and I've put out several op-eds with them as well. And one was, my third one from a week ago, was that Maria Corina Machado should go back to Venezuela. And she should go back to Venezuela with understanding that the U.S. government is going to protect her in Venezuela and start doing the hard work of reinvigorating and reigniting the passions of 30 million Venezuelans who, frankly, are yearning to be free. And that's what Juan Guaido did in 2019. He came to the States. He stuck out of the country, came to the States, went to the State of the Union address, and he flew back into Venezuela through the front door, Copa Airlines from Panama. And I greeted him upon arrival at the airport with other diplomats. And it was an amazing moment. People out in the streets crying, recognizing that they believe there was this opportunity for change. As long as Maria Corina and the rest of the democratic opposition are outside of Venezuela, now there's still some inside of Venezuela, of course, but the leadership is Maria Corina. She becomes increasingly irrelevant to the fight for democracy within the country.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that, obviously, and we will most likely be reaching out to you again in the coming months. So hopefully with good news and good change going on in Venezuela. But Jimmy, thanks so much.
Oya Saxa, wonderful to be here.
Yes.
Thank you much.